So we're so thrilled to bring this next guest back to the Rail Talk studio. She is the CEO of the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority, Lisa Lazarus. Welcome back to Rail Talk.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here again.
Great to have you. We always have awesome conversations. Sorry, I already interrupted you.
I feel like you guys are starting to look more like each other all the time as the podcast goes on. It's a bit of a twinning thing going on here.
That is quite a compliment to Joe.
Yeah, exactly. No, people say that. People say that a lot. We're getting more and more like brothers. John, you're like the brother I never wanted. So
exactly, right back at you, buddy.
Okay. So let's jump into it. There's a lot to report on, a lot to discuss. We'll start with some good news. The quarterly report for the racing fatalities was released last week. We're down to 0.83 at the HISA tracks. Lisa, it's hard to make a correlation one-to-one, especially with only 3 months of data. But just in your experience on the job, what are some of the things that you've seen that have helped lower that number?
So I think there's a number of things. One is I think there's a consciousness around, I think, equine welfare and safety that's really permeated the industry. There are all of our stakeholders, I think, for the most part, recognize the importance. And so there's sort of a collective effort and a collective focus. From the HISA standpoint, what's different kind of in the first quarter of 2024 is we're tracking everything in real time. We now have the data and the stats. And I have a dashboard on my computer where essentially I look every single day to see what the injuries look like, what the fatalities look like, if any. And if I see anything unusual, I immediately call in my team depending on which track, what my concern might be. And I have them reach out and follow up immediately. So if there's something to address, we're on it ASAP. We've also gotten much further along in our accreditations. So I think that's been an issue in that we're really engaging more with racetracks around, what they need to be doing to support the health and welfare initiatives. And so, there's certainly, I think, an impact of some of the rules, but it's not just that. And it's not just, I have to give a lot of credit to stakeholders in the industry because I think horsemen are working really hard to comply. Veterinarians are like the soldiers on the ground, especially the regulatory veterinarians. So there's so many kind of positive factors happening, but I do think HISA is the catalyst, you know what I mean? In terms of bringing everyone around the concept and part of the mission.
So Lisa, you've been in the job now for almost 2.5 years. It was February of 22, if I remember when you first took on this.
Exactly. Well done.
Yeah, we do a little research. So what has been the biggest challenges that you've been surprised about and your biggest accomplishments, you think, in the past 2 years?
I'll sort of answer that from more an organizational and personal. Okay. So in terms of organizational, probably the biggest challenge has just been building it, finding the right people. I mean, when I started, I had 2 people who were consultants and a blank piece of paper. And I had to even sit down and be like, where do I get a laptop? Where do I get my computer? Right. To be it was that fundamental. So The challenge, I think, is building an organization that can deliver on such an important and really complicated mission. And so I think organizationally, I'm most proud of the people. You've got Dr. Jennifer Durenberger leading, the safety and welfare piece. You've got Ann McGovern on racetrack safety, Mark Guilfoyle dealing with the stewards and the racing commissions. I'm incredibly proud of HIWU. I think they have really professionalized the sport. So we built that entire engine, from nothing. So I think basically the building blocks and creating the organization has been the thing I'm most proud of because I'm most indebted to the people. On a personal level, I think it's been it's having, I was really surprised coming in thinking that, I was essentially going to be helping to run a sport from a sports governance standpoint, and I have, a fair amount of experience doing that. I didn't anticipate some of the just almost mythical, resistance, just some of that, just people who just so sort of philosophically oppose the concept. Right. That was a little bit surprising to me. And so I think on a personal level, what I feel good about is I think most people would tell you that if they don't, even if they don't agree with me or they don't like something we've done, that they believe that I listen and that I'm reasonable and that my goal is to find the best outcome for the industry, even if you don't like the outcome that HISA reached.
Right.
So yeah, it goes to my answers sort of from an organizational and personal standpoint.
So you talk about how, there was some pushback from various entities and individuals, one of which is the state of Louisiana. So with the recent attempt to kind of go rogue and have their own rules and then pull it back, they got a lot of pushback, but I'm sure from your organization, they got a great amount of pushback. Is that kind of behind the scenes what happened?
Yeah, I mean, listen, Louisiana, as you know, was definitely one of the leaders in terms of, we don't want federal regulation, changing what we've been doing for decades. People ought to remember this, but Louisiana was under HISA for like a minute. It never was under HISA for the anti-doping program, but on the racetrack safety side, and I actually went down to Evangeline Downs in June of 2022 and presented to the jockeys and all that, and it was a really challenging environment.
Yeah.
But we had people and we had allies that we thought we would be able to work through, et cetera. And then they were obviously successful with West Virginia in achieving the injunction. So they sort of really sat outside of HISA. And I think one of the things that's happened with both Louisiana and West Virginia, which is sort of, unfortunate, is they've become a place for folks who can't operate under HISA rules to go and run. Mm-hmm. So suspended trainers, horses that can't pass our veterinary, inspections are often going to those places, I believe, to race. And so it's almost exacerbated the challenges I think that they have on the safety and integrity front. And I hope that as long as they're not under HISA, that they rise up to meet those challenges, because at the end of the day, we're one industry. And, right. You can talk about, we can all talk here and as insiders and inside baseball on, Louisiana is different. They're outside of HISA, but the regular person has no idea. You know what I mean?
And that's the big problem is the optics, is that if a horse breaks down,
together. Yeah,
exactly. If a horse breaks down on one of those racetracks, PETA and the general public aren't going to, delineate it as, well, they're not under, our jurisdiction. They just know that another horse broke down.
Correct.
Yeah, well, and I just want a quick follow up on that. I think one of the great things about that story and about them rescinding the rules showed how unified the sport is now and how unified the horsemen and the stakeholders are in service of keeping the horses safer and having a cleaner sport. Have you seen that? Have you seen more unification and more compromise and more collaboration than when you first started?
1,000%. I really do. I feel, listen, the sort of the folks who are going to always be our critics are probably going to be our critics at the end of time. Mm-hmm. But it's becoming a much, much smaller slice of the pie, or a much smaller part of the population. I really feel that there's a recognition at this point that HISA is here to stay. Mm-hmm. And that as an industry, we just need to make it work as well as it possibly can. And I do also see, I'm starting to get a lot more emails and texts that say, I really feel the difference. This has really changed things at my racetrack, right. Especially from a lot of smaller and mid-sized trainers who say, I feel like I can actually really compete for the first time. Right. And also, I think there's a recognition that we genuinely are making headway on welfare. Now, I know you said it was a small sample and we were just talking about the first quarter, but as I look at the last quarter, quarter one and quarter two of last year were well above 1. We were 1.35 and about 1.45. And then quarter three and quarter four, we were under 1. And so this first quarter of 2024 is kind of following that same trend. Mm-hmm. So listen, I get we're going to ebb and flow. We're not going to be able to necessarily keep the exact number but to me, it shows that it's achievable. It shows we can do it as an industry. And I doubt we're going to go really far back at any point in time, unless something really unusual happens. But overall, we have the rules, the processes, the people in place to run a really safe sport. And that's what the industry and the public deserve.
Yeah, well, it's really encouraging. That's what the horses deserve. Mm-hmm. you were talking about the breakdown rates. I read something in the release that HISA is going to start releasing, or at least collecting, numbers for training as well. Is that true?
100%. We're actually already doing it. We only didn't release it first quarter because we're still making sure that we're auditing it properly and stuff. We need a little bit more time to feel 100% confident in our numbers. So what we're going to do is sort of follow what we've done with racing deaths, which is that we're going to give them to everyone, to the public, in a sort of annual number at the beginning of 2025, and then start doing it quarterly.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I just had a question about the logistics of that, because watching the races, like, it's relatively easy to see a horse break down or a horse pull up and do some investigation and get the numbers that way. But in the training, it's not always filmed. There's a million horses on the track. Logistically, how do you guys collect that data as opposed to the racing data?
So there's a couple things. One is the regulatory veterinarians and the safety directors at every racetrack under HISA have a safety director. And they are obligated to report any death, training, racing, or other. We have a sort of other category for colics or accidents, maybe in transit or in the stall. And then on top of that, what's really been helpful is that we have HIWU veterinarians and test barns at every racetrack. And it's mandatory whenever there's a horse fatality that HIWU takes blood and hair. So that process kicks off. And so we always get a notification from HIWU, we took blood and hair from this horse on this date. And so then we can also double check that against the information that we've received or not received from the track. So we have a few different ways of auditing it. Mm-hmm. But that kind of relates back to why I was explaining that we're not going to give the numbers this year, is that we need to make sure that those processes are really foolproof. We don't want to announce numbers that we later realize are incomplete.
Lisa, I was just down in Ocala at the 2-year-old sale, and one of the conversations that some of the trainers and consigners were having is with regard to the fact that the three major sales companies kind of got together, I believe, with some of your guidance as well, to institute a new medication rule starting in the yearling sales for this coming cycle. Now, right now, it's my understanding that those horses are not technically under HISA purview.
Not the yearlings now.
With the yearlings, right? But the new rules and medication standards that came from your guidance, right? And your insistence.
Yes, I mean we really kind of got the sales companies together. I think it was like last October.
Yeah, which isn't easy. It's not easy to get them to agree on anything.
All in the same room, all talking. We basically said, listen, this is something that's really important. It's an all hands on deck moment. If we want to be confident that horses are safe and healthy, we need to start looking at this question at the very beginning of their lives, not just when they start their racing career. And so, we need your support. And ultimately, if you don't come on board and you don't kind of work with us, then you're likely to be regulated, and then you will have less of a say in what that structure looks like. Fortunately, they all recognize the importance of the moment and the importance of doing their part. And so we didn't face any resistance. And I hope that's going to continue to be the case.
The hot button issue the last month or so has been the metformin suspensions. The big one that got most of the news was George Weaver, but there's been a couple other ones. The HISA's original position was that there's no approved therapeutic use for metformin in horses. It could be synthesized to act as a steroid. Now you guys have backed off a little bit on that. You deferred some of the suspensions and want to have further review. Can you just take me through the timeline of that, and then what's kind of changed along the way to make you guys take a step back to look at it closer?
Sure. So one thing probably to just make sure everybody realizes is that we've tested probably like 80,000, 90,000 horses at this point, and we've only brought 5 anti-doping violations for metformin from start to finish. Mm-hmm. There is no therapeutic use for metformin in racehorses. There is a therapeutic use for it in older horses with equine metabolic syndrome, but that's really for horses that are older, heavier, etc. We, as I've said a number of times, we have intelligence through our tip lines, through our investigations unit, that there are some trainers who believe that it does bring certain performance enhancing effects, and they've been using it. I'm not saying that the ones that have tested positive or are facing those cases are necessarily those same trainers, but we do have that intelligence. And so that's how we were proceeding. We did raise, you may remember that at one point in time, we raised we called the minimum reporting level, so that we raised essentially the level so that we were confident that it was at a level at that point in time that was meaningful and not something that would just be sort of obviously a contaminant or an inadvertent transfer. That caused us to drop about 3 cases, which is why we also only had the 5. I'm going to say about a month ago, a new study came out on metformin, and it raised some questions around minimum reporting levels and other things. And so because of that, we felt that we wanted the RMGC Scientific Advisory Committee to kind of look at the issue, which they're doing. That's an independent group of scientific, qualified people who can examine this issue and look at the studies and kind of help us to make sure that our current policy as it stands is the right policy. We didn't dismiss any cases. We just simply, or my board felt and decided that while this scientific review was going forward, it was appropriate to lift any provisional suspension so that in the event that there's an outcome that changes anything, we don't have anybody who's sitting on provisional suspension. It doesn't mean that their cases are dismissed. They still have to go through the whole process, but they won't be suspended during the pendency of this review.
Okay. And I always have this discussion with people about, well, HISA's moving the goalposts. And it's like, no, they're understanding that this is a new organization, that they're trying to implement new rules. And when they see that there's a change or that they need to modify something, they have the ability to make that change. It's not that they're moving the goalposts and changing the rules just to confuse everybody. The other argument that I want to discuss with you, or the other thing that comes up a lot is, people be like, well, it's this picogram. Everyone all of a sudden is a specialist when it comes to
pharmacologist.
The pharmacologist, exactly. I mean, I can't even spell the damn word. I know a lot of people, can't even understand it. But I explain to them, you have to understand, Lisa has a legal background, and this is all based in law. It's not like we're picking on certain trainers and avoiding other trainers, or that, that there's an environmental taint in the water in Lexington and that's not being accounted for, that, a bunch of grooms decided that they were going to pee in one stall. And that's why, can you just walk us through some of these, what I call myths as far as defense
sure.
myths?
No, that's a great question. First of all, one thing I just want to respond to before I talk about picograms is, in any anti-doping program, the science evolves, okay? And what we know today about substances is completely different than what we knew 20 years ago, 5 years ago, even last year, right? Mm-hmm. So if you were going to run an anti-doping program and you say, we're not going to modify things even when the science changes, I think totally unethical. Right. So by definition, you're going to have to see changes and things that happen, because science is always giving us new information. And there's no way any anti-doping program can be completely knowledgeable about every single substance that it regulates. Secondly, when it comes to picograms, I love, people send me texts all the time. It's such a low level. Like, how do you know?
How do you know?
A, you don't have the level, and B, you have no context for what a high level is. Like, a picogram of one drug can be incredibly impactful. Mm-hmm. And of another drug, it can be completely meaningless. It's just like, Mary Clay always talks about a pound of broccoli and a pound of chocolate. They're both a pound, but they're entirely different substances. Right. So the idea that we're regulating things that are completely minuscule and trace amounts is really untrue. And that's particularly untrue when it comes to substances that can be found in the environment or are routinely used, like human medications or environmental contaminants. We would certainly, regulate a picogram or something very small of EPO or an anabolic steroid, or things where, there's no way it could have gotten into the horse's system. It wasn't intentional. And the low level is probably related to the timing of the test. But also, don't forget too, a level of something is also very much related to when the test was taken. It's a timing issue as well. Right. And the other thing that I think people don't realize is, when we talk about like 1 nanogram per milliliter, that's per milliliter in the horse. And the horse has thousands of milliliters in its body. I think some people think it's just 1 nanogram in the whole horse.
Right.
Which is obviously not the case. So these ideas around trace and picogram and milligrams and all that, they're meaningless without context. And these are things that, you know, one of the best things about HISA is that the laboratories meet weekly and they talk weekly about what they're seeing, what they're finding, what the levels should be, and they adjust all the time. We've never had that in horse racing. Mm-hmm. And that was one of, I think, the biggest inequalities, is that you go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction under different standards. And so science is always top of mind, and the decisions that they make around these minimum reporting levels are based on science and based on consultation. And they're absolutely not made by me or anybody at HIWU, anybody on HISA staff. We are completely, none of us have the expertise to make those decisions. They're made by scientists based on science.
Right. Yeah. So basically, you wouldn't bring a case. You know, you wouldn't suspend a trainer unless you had. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but just an exorbitant amount of evidence that something was going on. It wasn't just that it was a couple of grams over the testing. Because of your legal background, I would assume. Yeah,
I mean, I guess the way that I would answer that is everything that we do is based on the science, right? A laboratory, we don't charge, or I should say, HIWU doesn't charge trainers based on their reputation, their conduct, et cetera.
Right. If they're a good guy or a bad guy, or
bad, positive, or negative, right? Right. And all of the thought that goes into what makes that sample positive or negative is methodical. It is thought through. It has been tested, and et cetera. And I'm not saying that with new science, we will one day find out that something should have been maybe a little bit different. But where we sit today is based on a lot of thought, a lot of consultation, and a tremendous amount of expertise.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's obviously the way to do it, is to trust the scientists, especially when none of us are particularly experts in the field.
And actually, one thing I want to say, because it's one of the things that I found so interesting about the industry, is there's an incredible amount of desire for HISA and HIWU to play this good guy, bad guy thing, right? Like this guy, John Smith, he's never had a positive test. He's the greatest guy. And there's no way he can have a positive, and so you're completely wrong if you got that out. Then you've got but Dan, Dan, Johnson, that guy is like, we all know he's cheating, so you should throw the book at him. And you can't operate a program like that, and we never will. We treat everyone the same. We treat everyone based on the science. Most of us, I mean, I'm out there a little bit more, so I'm a bit more familiar, but the HIWU people have almost no idea who the trainers are and where they operate and what their reputations are. Right. It's based on the rules and based on, what the processes are. And I'm always surprised by, if you ask something I'm really surprised by, you have trainer A will say to me, I can't believe, you're suspending trainer B. That guy is a good guy and he would never do that. Even though trainer A lines up his horse, at the starting gate every day against trainer B, they're much more focused on worrying that it could be them than realizing that maybe we're doing them a service by taking somebody sort of out of competition or changing their practices who might be beating them unfairly, Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a fraternity.
Yeah, that's the instinct. Exactly, the instinct is you're treating them wrong as opposed to you're protecting me.
Right. Yeah. Well, I do want to ask a quick follow-up on that, because I do think context is important. And I wonder how much, you say it's kind of like a blind thing where you're just focusing on the science. But I do think that the context of how many violations a trainer's had before, how many horses he's had breakdown, et cetera, does matter in terms of meting out, sanctions, because that's how the legal system works.
No, obviously, it does. Maybe I should explain it a bit differently.
Yeah.
What I mean by is the actual charge itself, like the actual notification you've had a positive sample, is blind. Okay. But once you start going through the process, absolutely all those factors are taken into consideration. Certainly by an arbitrator, they'd be taken into consideration in a settlement discussion. By definition, we have, sanctions that obviously increase based on the number of times we've had a positive. So all of that is very much in consideration, but not Well, I guess what I was saying is I think there's a view or a sense that we should throw positives out before we even gonna get them going.
Right.
They're kind of from a good guy, and we can't do that. You know,
Right.
you have the chance to explain yourself, you have the chance to bring evidence, show your good record, of course, but we can't just say we're not gonna follow the process.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. So Lisa, let's project 3, 5, 10 years down the road. You've been doing this, and at some stage, you're ready to hand the keys off to somebody else. What would you say to that incoming person at that point as hey, make sure you do blank before you turn the lights off?
There's a couple things. One is, to me, one of the most important things is the professionalism. You know, I view us as a customer service organization. You know, we exist for the industry. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that all of my staff know is that it is completely unacceptable to not treat everybody with respect, to not answer everyone. Like, I really pride us on being incredibly responsive. We don't ignore emails. We don't, even the craziest things that we respond to, you know, and to never lose sight of the fact that you can feel entitled. It's a privilege to serve the industry, and you need to be incredibly responsive and aware and empathetic to things that are happening, you know, within the industry. The other thing I want to throw in, because you didn't quite ask this question, but it's related and it's an important goal for me.
Right.
My goal is, in terms of what's a metric for success of HISA, is when no one's talking about safety and integrity anymore, when it's just a given. Yeah. When no one's saying like, oh, this fatality, that injury, they're just talking about the amazing stories in horse racing, the horses, the trainers, the jockeys. Like, it's far in the background, but it's just accepted that it's there. Yeah. That, to me, will be when we've achieved the success. So the regulator really shouldn't be front and center, right? They should be doing their job in the background and kind of creating this like protective envelope almost around the sport, so the sport can do what it does best, which is have these exciting moments and these great stories.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we talked about last week when we were talking about the Triple Crown season and how safe it was. Ideally, that wouldn't be a story. It is a story now because of what happened last year at the Derby, but now it's a positive story, and ideally we get to a point where we're not reporting. We don't feel compelled to report that no horses broke down on the track during the Triple Crown. Quick question about some news that broke yesterday. HISA has proposed several rule changes to the racetrack safety program that have been approved by the Federal Trade Commission, will go into effect on Monday, July 8th. Main thing, for like top line headline, the stand down time for fetlock corticosteroid injections will go from 14 days before working, and we'll go to 14 days before working and 30 days before racing. That's double the previous rules. Can you talk about why that was important?
Yeah, so, you know, the rules for the most part kind of cleaned up and fixed things that we realized weren't working, or oversights. There's a lot of stuff around the voided claim rule that we had to kind of fix and improve. That is probably the corticosteroid stand down time is probably the only kind of new rule that's sort of a lot more rigorous and is going to have an impact. The racetrack safety committee who makes these decisions looked very carefully at the research and engaged a lot with, some of the California regulators, and really believed that the numbers showed that, given the fact that the fetlock is far and away the most common injury in racing, that injections really exacerbate the risk, that was something that we needed to regulate. You know, they talked about having a stand down time, that those stand down times for any joint for 30 days if it's corticosteroid, and we backed off of that and really limited it to fetlock. I spoke to a lot of trainers in this process. It's not, ultimately these are not my decisions, but I still obviously like to be really, really educated about it. And most who I trust told me that they're unlikely to run a horse back in 30 days if they have an injection in their fetlock. You know, you do hear a lot of people who say to you, you're just going to create a situation where the cheaters are just going to still cheat and do it anyways. They're going to say they're injecting knees, but they're going to inject fetlocks, et cetera. You know, we hear those types of arguments a lot, and you can't really build a regulatory system around that, the way that people are not going to follow it. You've got to find ways to, to regulate it. You've got to find ways to enforce it. And you've got to, I think, lead with what you think the rules and the policies should be. So I know that's going to be an adjustment for some people, but obviously the Racetrack Safety Committee really believes, and I think the evidence is there, that it has a meaningful impact on welfare, and that we've got to be really sort of brutal in how we protect our horses and how we protect our injury rates, because that's, as we all know, ultimately an existential risk to horse racing.
Yep. Lisa, last question for me, and thank you again for all your time. I know you're super busy. Let's talk a little bit about the investigative arm of HISA. Is it doing everything that you hope it can? Is it need to be changed over the next window? In order to be able to kind of catch some of the or add evidence to some of the testing that's going on. We don't talk much about the investigative portion of it. Just give the audience a little bit of insight as to what you're seeing on that side of HISA.
Sure. So the investigative arm is run by Sean Richards, the former FBI agent, and I have a tremendous amount of confidence and trust in him. The one thing you'll have to realize is that the testing program is really immediate, right? We test horses, we get positives. Some people joke that the testing program is more of an IQ test because, you're going to have to anticipate that you're going to be tested at some point, right? The investigations have the opportunity to be a lot more impactful in terms of regulating the sport, but they also take time. You've got to build them. And if you look at, the New York investigations that Sean Richards led ultimately to the prosecutions, those were over multiple years, So there's a lot of things that are happening in the background. There's a lot of evidence collection. There's a lot of, if you're talking about people that we really don't want in the sport and that have been a detriment to the sport, they've been in it for a long time and they're, pretty careful and pretty crafty. And so we've got to build cases and evidence and also make sure that, we're being fair in terms of, when we bring a case against someone, that we have really reliable evidence. So I am really happy with the work they're doing, but a lot of it is very much behind the scenes and has not yet, come to light. But I do think that in the next year or so, you'll start to see some of the benefits of those investigations.
Because part of the intro, saying to Joe, part of the intro of being added to these new boards that Joe and I have been, is that there's kind of a hazing window. So we have to dress up as a two-person horse costume, but you guys have to tell us what barn to go into. That's part of all the investigative undercover work, right?
100%.
Or no comment. No comment.
We're I forgot to tell you, one of the things that the Horseman Advisory Group and the Next Gen Group does is we actually give you each at least like 1 or 2 barn searches a year. So, I hope you're getting ready for that. And
we get our magnifying glasses out and everything.
And the thing you should know is that when you conduct a barn search, people are usually very, very excited to have you there. Right. Like they're going to start serving you cookies and milk.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. I'm sure we'll be the most popular people on the backstretch.
Exactly.
Lisa, thank you so much for the time. I do want to say one thing about the new rules. I just want to mention HISA is going to be hosting a webinar for trainers on Monday, July 1st at 2 Eastern to cover the impact of the new modified rules that I mentioned earlier, and they'll include a Q&A on the changes. That's, I think, one of the things, one of a real feather in your cap, and for the entire organization, the accessibility. And that continues, and it's so important, especially as we're kind of adjusting things along the way. So thank you for being available. Thank you for being thoughtful, and appreciate the time as always, Lisa.
Thank you. And please attend that seminar because we really want to be able to share the information, and it's sometimes hard to reach everyone. So give us that chance. Thank you both for your support.